again, everyone. As Terry said, my name is Arnaud Lauret. I'm French, so that's why I speak Franglish. So you may also know me as API On Demand. That's the name of my blog. You have the others here. And more importantly, I'm API governance lead at Postman. I joined this company last year. For those who don't know what is Postman, Postman is a platform for creating and using APIs. And it aims to simplify every step of the API lifecycle and facilitate collaboration so you can create better APIs or better applications using APIs faster. I'm in a team called Postman Open Technologies, and we aim to analyze, understand, explain the world of APIs. And we also support and invest open source API tools and specification, especially async API, JSON schema, or microgs. You may have heard that to leverage API successfully, you may need something called API governance. So I'm API governance lead, so that's why I talk about this. But honestly, it has a very bad reputation. People don't like it. They think it's complicated. It slows down, it limits, and in the end, it's not really useful and it doesn't work. Unfortunately, that's sometimes true. But what if the problem was not API governance, but misunderstanding? What is API governance? Why do we need it? What is its real purpose? That's what I'd like to talk about today. I will first explore 3 different visions of API governance, from the most terrible one to the ideal one. And afterwards, I will share a few tips to help you hopefully implement it the right way, but also to better grasp its real purpose. So there are many aspects to consider when you are creating an API. What it does, what it looks like, how it's implemented, will it be easy to evolve, security, architecture, and so on. But let's focus on design. And that's not only because I wrote a book about the design of web APIs, which is conveniently titled The Design of Web APIs. But let's concentrate on design and on norms or guidelines or standards, because that's usually where people expect to see API governance. What happens without them? Let's say 2 designers have to design a search for customers and a search for products operations. They will be working on very specific topics like how to model a customer and how to model a product. But they will also work on generic design patterns, how to model a list, how to manage search filters, paginations, what happens if no results are found. There are many options, many design options to design operation like this. There are good ones, there are bad ones, and if you want, you can create your very own solution that nobody has thought before. In the end, these 2 operations, which are similar, designed by 2 different people without standards, will look and behave differently. And the right or best design options may not have been chosen. This means that in absence of standards, people, especially API designers, waste their time reinventing wheels that are inconsistent and maybe not that round. What does this mean for development? When developers use search for customers in an application, they will analyze it to understand how it works, how a list is represented, how search filters are managed, pagination, absence of result, and they will write some code accordingly. Later, when the same developer uses the other operation, search for products, in an application, the same or another one, they will have to start over again. Because although these two operations are search operations, they don't share the same look and feel. Without common standards, what they have learned and coded before is useless. They have to start from scratch again. Icing on the cake, it also applies to the other neglected developers, the one who code the implementation. Each implementation of a search operation will have variations induced by the different design. So let's imagine that happens for every operation of every API. At the organization level, this means a lot of people will waste a lot of time. The productivity of designers, developer of implementation, developer of consuming application, their productivity will be far from optimum. And this impact on productivity will have adverse consequences on delivery dates, the ability to deliver new features, and ultimately, the organization's revenue. And if APIs are public, possible customers, developers, may not choose to use these inconsistent and complex APIs and look for other solutions. This means even less revenue for the organization. So in conclusion, the absence of design standards doesn't just lead to inconsistent APIs that may not leverage the best design patterns. It makes everyone's job harder, more complicated than it should be. And that has negative impact on the organization's revenue. Pro tip, if you want your boss to change the mindset, talk about that. Money is always important. So when people realize this, what do they say? Oh, we need to create consistent APIs to avoid this mess. We need API governance. Let's set up some design standards and ensure that they're applied strictly. Design standards are indeed necessary. The intention is good. What could go wrong? Have you heard about API design reviews? The dreaded API design review is what people fear the most when their organization implements an API policy. Sorry, API governance. API governance. So let's read a partial transcript of an API review conducted in such organization. And so we'll only concentrate on what the person conducted the review says. Seriously, what's wrong with you? Your design is a total mess. You still don't know that for a search operation, you have to apply our standard rules 318, 367, 545 to 553, and 666. And the response to this operation contains a non-standard representation of the customer resource. I don't care if it doesn't fit to your need. You have to use it. It's non-negotiable. And research filters and pagination don't match our standards. What? Our standards make the API more complex to use, to implement, different from what people are used to? We don't care about developer complaints and what's going on in the outside world. These are the rules that apply here. And be more meticulous. Well, it took me almost 2 days to check, but I noticed that of the hundreds of properties in your data models, 2 have names that are not in camel case. So you need to fix all that before you can start development. And the next available slot for review is in 4 weeks. Oh, that affects your deadlines. That's not my problem. It's your constraint. And for your information, if you don't know how to fix the design because you don't understand the standards, we can do it for you in 5 weeks. But it would be better to take advantage of that option. You think too much. You always ask why, complain about the standards, the rules, the documentation that goes with them, the length of the process. It will be simpler for everyone if you leave this to us. That's the end of the transcript. What happens afterward? A few months later, an exhausted, burned-out API designer left the organization, but an API perfectly aligned with the organization standards was deployed. Maybe a little bit late regarding the deadlines. Unfortunately, nobody used it. Not so much because the organization standards lead to complicated APIs. Indeed, after years of suffering, people got used to them. No, nobody used it because this API doesn't respond to any need. This story sounds like a Franz Kafka novel, and yet it's hardly an exaggeration. Between you and me, everything that I've said actually happened. I've seen that with my very own eyes. I will not say names. Complex standards, difficult to understand and use, made up of hundreds of rules, which differ from what is happening in the real world, won't make API designers and API developers' life easier. Such standards make API complex to design, complex to understand, complex to use, and everyone, in the end, wastes their time, makes mistakes. And the experts who put those standards in place, they will also waste their time explaining them over again and again. And they also will debate again and again of the many contentious points of detail. Consistency. It is essential, but there are limits. The quest for an extreme consistency is counterproductive, forcing all the teams of all the business lines, of all subsidiaries of a gigantic group to use strict fine-grained data modeling standards for all of their API is a total nonsense. This makes API very difficult to design and can lead to API that will at best look awkward and at worst be unusable. All this for APIs that belongs to different API landscapes, different sets of API that will never be perceived as a whole by any consumer. And finally, on the topic of consistency, ensuring that an API is aligned with some standards does not magically turn it into the right API. It will just have the right look and feel. But that's not a guarantee that it will solve the right problem. Manually checking the smallest detail of an API is time-consuming and error-prone. And I can tell you that I did that, and it was terrible. Blocking process, overly long delays, that makes all this worse. All this slows down API implementation and delivery. And as Gunnar said, when you are working on APIs for regulation, you cannot shift delivery. And finally, the top of the top, an aggressive and despotic attitude from the API governance experts will lead to a situation where nobody knows how to create API and nobody wants to. API creators won't develop their design skill in such a context. Valuable people may leave the organization. Everything will be delegated to a few experts, creating bottlenecks. Seen in this slide, API governance seems more dangerous than the disease we're trying to cure. And we may understand why it has this reputation. It's an excruciating experience for everyone involved. And it can lead to potentially a huge loss of value for the organization. Fortunately, it can be quite different. Let's see how an API governance that helps people can work. Here, API design standards are being put in place by or with the people creating APIs. They exist to guarantee an appropriate level of consistency within the organization. They exist to help people design API, giving them some counsel about it. They are consistent with the outside world practice, and so they contribute to create APIs that everyone can use, because they look like any other API in the world. These standards are designed to facilitate the work of designers. To design a search for customer operation, you can consult how to design a search operation and follow a recipe, instead of having to identify which of the hundreds of rules you have to follow. Many design standard rules can be automated. There's nothing more precise than a linter, a program that will scan an OpenAPI document. And, for example, prevents you from having 2 properties over 3,000 that are not in camel case, or tell you that you are missing some pagination, search filters on such operation. We can even go a step further and leverage linter to teach things to people. What is the structure of an OpenAPI document? How you can use HTTP? What are the pros and cons of a design pattern? Thanks to the work of internal API advocates, developers, business people, managers, executives are aware of the importance of API, but also the importance of doing them right, and what exists in the organization to help create them. This way, beginners API designer will know where to turn for help for their first API. Forget the design review. Instead, you have a design workshop with an expert API designer. Together, they will discuss the requirements, the needs to cover, and determine which API or APIs and operations to create and design them. In the making, they will learn where to find the guidelines, how to use them, how to take advantage of API tools like the linter that will guide them in their design. And if they need to see more, because sometimes when you design an API, you can't see all the design patterns and everything. So if they want to see more and faster, they can enroll for an API design training course. With this support, they quickly develop their API design skills, even if they have never designed API before, even if they are not developer but business analyst, because they are very various profile designing APIs. So the aim here is for the normative aspects, the basic design pattern, to become natural as quickly as possible. And so they can spend more time on important questions, such as, are we creating the right API? Does this API cover the needs we priorly identified? And is it user-friendly? Is it easy to understand? Easy to use? More experienced API designer will be more autonomous. For them, again, forget the review. It's more accompaniment, coaching. The first step is to discuss the requirements, the needs, so they can confront their ideas with an expert. Here, what we want to do is to make sure we are creating the right API, but also to assess if there are any particular points that are out of the ordinary and not covered by the guidelines. Then they design the API based on the guidelines, leveraging the linter. Experts can provide feedback on the interface contract in the light of the initial discussion about the requirements, and so we can ensure that the API does the job properly and is easy to understand and use. Unless the new API leads to changes in the guidelines to adapt existing recipes or add new ones, discussion will mainly focus on understanding the needs, API reusability, and user experience. During these discussions, there may be disagreements, because we are not always designing API in the same way. Unless the designer's solution goes against some fundamental principles that are written in the guidelines, or security, which also described in the guidelines, the designer should always have the last word. It's their APIs. And so they should make informed decisions based on the experts' comments and proposals. API design experts are completely autonomous. Obviously, they may request feedback from colleagues or future consumers, because you cannot design an API completely alone. You need to be sure that it works for others. And above all, these API design experts are the experts I was talking about before, the one helping the others to grow their skill. So these experts take part in design workshops, training sessions, coaching sessions. They work on the guidelines. Thanks to all this, everyone involved in API creation has an excellent user experience. They develop their skills, increase their productivity, and quickly create the right APIs in the right way, naturally. These useful APIs can be used by everyone and reused in many contexts. All this maximizes the value generated directly and indirectly by APIs. Ultimately, API governance dissolves in everyday practice. The ideal goal is for everyone to be as autonomous as possible and as expert as needed. Important point: very often, the creation of an API is reduced to designing a software interface that someone will use writing a few lines of code. But creating an API is much more than that. You define a product, you design it, you document it, you define the architecture, infrastructure that will run it, you implement it, you secure it, you test it, you expose it, you provide it to consumers, and sometimes you sell it. There are many areas to cover and simplify to create APIs. There are many people with different perspectives to upskill or collaborate with to ensure that ultimately we will create the right API in the right way, smoothly. That's why I define API governance as helping people with an holistic approach to maximize the value generated by APIs. It's not about rules. It's not about processes or yelling at people. These are only tools to achieve this goal, if we accept yelling at people. Now that we have a definition of what is governance, I'd like to share with you a few tips to facilitate its implementation and better grasp what it is. Tip number one: when establishing API governance, you must have 4 values in mind: alignment, collaboration, a user experience, and enablement. Let's see what it means. Governance is not about defining rules for the sake of defining rules. Everything that is put in place must contribute to maximize the value generated directly or indirectly by the APIs in alignment with the organization's objectives and constraints. If a rule or a process or a tool or whatever doesn't contribute to this, do not add it to your API governance. All stakeholders, all teams that directly or indirectly contribute to the creation and the use of APIs must collaborate. For example, guidelines need to be defined in agreement with the teams who will be using them. You need to onboard security infrastructure teams so they can integrate their constraints in the guidelines, the tools, the process in a reasonable way, not forgetting the objectives of all this. You may have heard about DX, the ultimate user experience for API. Yes, it's important, but user experience is also a concern for API governance. You must be careful with that. People must be happy with what API governance proposes and how it works. API governance is there to guide people, set up rails, so you just need to follow them to achieve your goal, which is delivering the right API in the right way. So, for instance, remember the idea of recipes in your guideline instead of having hundreds of rules? You need the rules, but you need to package them. Linter, and please avoid yelling at people. That doesn't work. API governance is an enabler. It exists to lower the barrier to API creation, not to control people. And API governance is not about doing things for others, because you will create bottlenecks. You will not have people who will take responsibility of creating API. So it's about simplifying things as much as possible and making people as autonomous as possible and becoming experts when it is actually needed. Tip number 2, leverage an API lifecycle. So every API goes through a multi-stage process, including definition, design, development, testing before being deployed and distributed to consumer. You may be doing this intuitively without realizing it. The Postman API lifecycle you see here has been established based on the studies of many companies. It's possible that you don't need all those steps. You have more, you have less. That's not the question. What's essential in formalizing an API lifecycle for API governance and for API in general is that it allows you to identify all the steps you need to go through to actually create an API, as well as the actors involved at each stage. These are the people who will be most likely to define or help to define the rules, practices, process, tools that can help people creating APIs to go through each step and ultimately help them create APIs. Tip number 3, very often, the idea of API governance emerges when you already have many APIs, because this is where you realize that, oh, what is this mess? We need something. We need a little bit of consistency in there. So sometimes there are so many APIs that you are overwhelmed. You don't know where to start. Categorizing APIs in different ways will help you to find where to start, where to put the focus on. So you can start by classifying APIs based on their level of exposure. APIs exposed on the internet are more at risk than private APIs. Another question could be, who use my APIs? Public and partnered APIs are more valuable than private ones. But even private APIs are heterogeneous. The value of a private API will vary depending on who uses them. An API that is only used by the team creating it has less value than a private API used across different teams, across different business lines within an organization. Last tip, it's highly unlikely that you will achieve a complete and perfect API governance at first try. You will have to do it step by step. So start by defining a few initial standards. Usually look at your APIs. There are probably things you can take. Do not try to change everything. Then use them on selected APIs, selected teams, measure the effect, see what it works, what's not working, repeat, broaden the impact with each iteration. And it's time to wrap up. If there is only one thing you take away from this session, I hope it will be this definition of API governance. So API governance is not about constraining people with rules, processes, standards for the sake of processes and standards. API governance is about helping people maximize the value generated by APIs. And it's about doing this with an holistic approach, taking all aspects into account. So do not focus only on design, because if you do that, people may do mistakes or reinvent the wheel when they implement their API, when they secure their API. So you really have to have this 360 degrees approach. And put rails, automate things, so people are autonomous, just have to follow the rails, and they can concentrate on what's really important. Are we creating the right API? Does this cover all the needs? So in the end, we achieve not the objective of the API, but the objective of the organization we are working in. And that's it.